The silver screen preserved them at their most perfect, frozen in time as young, radiant, and seemingly immortal. For millions of viewers, the actresses of Hollywood's golden age were not simply beautiful women, they were the very definition of beauty itself. Their faces loomed larger than life, their glamour appearing eternal, untouched by time or consequence. On film, they never aged, never faltered, never lost the glow that made them objects of fascination and desire. But the cameras eventually stopped rolling, and the spotlights inevitably dimmed. When the industry moved on, these women were left to face something far more devastating than any fictional tragedy they had ever performed: the loss of the very image that had defined their value to the world. This is not a story about aging in the natural sense. It is a story about what happens when an entire identity is constructed around appearance, and what remains when that appearance can no longer be controlled. If beauty is the reason the world loves you, what happens when that beauty begins to change? What is more frightening? Growing old in silence, or growing old beneath the relentless scrutiny of millions who remember you only as you once were? Did Hollywood ever truly love these women, or did it only love the carefully manufactured images it projected onto the screen? For most people, aging unfolds gradually and privately, a process negotiated without constant judgment. But for Hollywood's most beautiful women, growing older meant watching their most valuable professional asset dissolve under the merciless gaze of fans, critics, and studio executives who had built enormous fortunes on their faces. There was no second identity waiting for them beyond beauty, no prepared transition into another form of worth. When youth faded, so too did relevance. Some of these women fought time with every weapon available to them, clinging desperately to an image that the industry refused to let evolve. Others withdrew from public view entirely, choosing invisibility over humiliation. And some faced challenges that went far beyond normal aging: illness, addiction, mental health collapse, and systemic neglect that ravaged their beauty from the inside out. In many cases, the truth arrived far too late. Illness was mistaken for vanity, suffering dismissed as decline, and by the time understanding emerged, there was often no one left to save. These are not cautionary tales about fame or morality. They are profoundly human stories about women trapped in an impossible dilemma, forced to watch as the world continued to celebrate a frozen version of who they once were, while quietly abandoning the people they were becoming. Among these stories, one stands apart: a tragedy so devastating that Hollywood itself took decades to call it by its real name. When Hedy Lamarr arrived in Hollywood in the late 1930s, her beauty seemed almost unreal, as if it had been designed rather than born. With perfectly symmetrical features, luminous skin, and dark, hypnotic eyes, she was not simply attractive, she appeared otherworldly. Studio head Louis B. Mayer promoted her as the most beautiful woman in the world, a title that was not meant as exaggeration but as a statement of fact. Unlike many actresses whose appeal rested on distinctive quirks or fashionable looks, Lamarr embodied a kind of classical perfection that felt timeless, immune to trends and eras. The camera lingered on her face because it could not do otherwise. What made her beauty especially powerful was its apparent effortlessness. On screen, in films like Algiers, Samson and Delilah, and White Cargo, she did not need exaggerated gestures or theatrical emotion. Her presence alone dominated the frame. Co-stars often felt diminished simply by sharing a scene with her. But when the world looked at Hedy Lamarr, it rarely asked a deeper question. Was she allowed to be anything beyond the face everyone worshipped? Behind that flawless image lived a mind few in Hollywood ever acknowledged. In her spare time, Lamarr worked obsessively on inventions, teaching herself advanced concepts in engineering and physics. During World War II, she co-developed a frequency-hopping communication system designed to prevent enemy forces from jamming Allied torpedoes. The technology would later become foundational to modern GPS, Bluetooth, and Wi-Fi. Yet, at the height of her fame, this intelligence was not celebrated, it was concealed. Lamarr feared that revealing her intellect would shatter the illusion Hollywood had built around her. As she once remarked with bitter irony, Glamour required stillness, silence, and the appearance of ignorance. If her mind was known, would her beauty still be tolerated? As Lamarr entered her 40s, the roles that once arrived effortlessly began to disappear. Not because her talent had faded, but because Hollywood had no interest in allowing its most beautiful woman to age naturally on screen. The same industry that had elevated her image now quietly withdrew its attention. Younger actresses replaced her, while the press, once reverent, began to scrutinize her appearance with casual cruelty. When beauty is treated as destiny, what happens when destiny starts to slip? With no alternative identity prepared for her, Lamarr turned to cosmetic procedures in an era when plastic surgery was still primitive and dangerous. Beginning in the 1,960 seconds, she underwent multiple operations using outdated techniques, hoping to preserve the face that had defined her existence. Instead, the results distorted it. The symmetry that once seemed mathematically perfect began to stretch and collapse. In later years, driven by desperation and isolation, Lamarr reportedly attempted cosmetic interventions on herself, convinced she could fix what doctors could not. What happens when the person most trapped by an image is the one trying to repair it? By the 1,970 seconds, Hedy Lamarr had become increasingly reclusive, refusing public appearances and avoiding photographs whenever possible. On the rare occasions she was seen, the contrast between her current appearance and her legendary image shocked the public. The woman once celebrated as the embodiment of perfection now struggled to be recognized at all. In her final decades, she lived largely alone, communicating with the outside world by telephone, carefully protecting herself from being seen. Silence became her last form of control. The cruel irony of Lamarr's story is that recognition of her brilliance came only at the end of her life, long after it could offer her a new sense of identity. In 1997, she received a major award honoring her technological contributions, but she was too withdrawn to attend the ceremony herself. The world finally acknowledged her mind, but by then, she had already vanished from view. Hollywood had preserved her beauty forever on film, yet provided no space for her to exist once beauty was no longer enough. If Hollywood's golden age ever had a single image that defined glamour, it was Rita Hayworth tossing her fiery red hair in Gilda. She was not simply beautiful, she embodied desire itself. Soldiers carried her image through World War II, studios built fantasies around her, and audiences believed her allure was immune to time. Even in her late 30s and early 40s, an age when many actresses quietly faded, Hayworth still appeared radiant and controlled, as films like Pal Joey suggested a woman aging with elegance. So, how did someone so luminous become a symbol of one of Hollywood's most heartbreaking declines? The first signs were subtle and easily dismissed. In the late 1,950 seconds, Hayworth began forgetting lines on set, losing track of conversations, and struggling with simple directions. At first, stress and alcohol were blamed, convenient explanations in an industry that normalized both. Hayworth herself believed this was the cause. But the confusion did not pass, it deepened. During the filming of The Money Trap in 1965, she sometimes froze mid-scene, visibly disoriented, unsure of where she was or what she was doing. What does it do to a woman when she senses her mind betraying her, but no one can explain why? As her cognitive decline progressed, it quietly altered her appearance. The expressive face that once carried vulnerability and warmth began to flatten. Her movements grew hesitant. Most haunting were her eyes, once alive with intelligence and charm, now reflecting fear and uncertainty. To the public, these changes were cruelly misread. Gossip columnists suggested she was drunk. Magazines published unflattering photos, asking what had happened to Rita Hayworth. No one recognized the truth, because the truth had not yet entered public understanding. Hayworth was suffering from early-onset Alzheimer's disease, striking her while she was still in her 50s. At the time, the illness was poorly understood and rarely diagnosed. Without answers, she lived in quiet terror, aware that something essential was slipping away. Her daughter later recalled receiving repeated phone calls, the same questions asked again and again, each one carrying confusion and fear. How do you cope when you know you are changing but cannot name the enemy? As the disease advanced, Hayworth could no longer care for herself. Grooming became difficult, then impossible. Her weight fluctuated as she forgot meals or ate repeatedly without remembering. Stress etched itself into her face, deepening lines and draining expression. By the mid-1970s, photographs showed a woman almost unrecognizable, not simply aged, but emptied. In rare lucid moments, she reportedly looked at old publicity photos and asked, "Who is that beautiful girl?" When told it was her, she could not believe it. When Hayworth died in 1987 at just 68, she had been absent from her own life for years. Her beauty was not destroyed by vanity or excess, but erased by a disease that stole her mind before it stole her face. And that is what makes her story so devastating. Gloria Grahame was never a conventional Hollywood beauty. She did not have the flawless symmetry of Elizabeth Taylor or the polished elegance of Grace Kelly. What she possessed was something more unsettling and unforgettable. Her slightly pouty upper lip, heavy-lidded eyes, and smoky voice gave her a sensual presence that defined the femme fatale of film noir. In films like In a Lonely Place, The Big Heat, and The Bad and the Beautiful, her beauty felt dangerous rather than decorative. Yet the feature audiences found irresistible was the one Grahame herself could not accept. To viewers, her upper lip was distinctive. To Grahame, it was a defect. Despite winning an Academy Award and reaching the height of her career in the early 1950s, she became fixated on altering it. Why would a woman celebrated for her uniqueness feel compelled to erase it? And what does that say about an industry that praises individuality while quietly demanding perfection? At first, her attempts were small and secret. According to accounts from the period, Grahame experimented with temporary methods, placing cotton or tissue beneath her lip to change its shape. These makeshift solutions soon escalated. Cosmetic surgery in the 1950s was still crude and risky, yet Grahame pursued it anyway. Rather than trusting a single surgeon, she reportedly underwent multiple procedures with different doctors, none fully aware of the other's work. Some reports even suggest she attempted amateur modifications herself. The damage accumulated quickly. By the late 1950s, the change was impossible to hide. Her upper lip became swollen, stiff, and visibly scarred. Muscle movement was restricted, leaving her face partially frozen. Expressions that once conveyed seduction and emotional depth now appeared strained and unnatural. Cinematographers struggled to light her face without revealing the damage, relying on soft focus and shadows to preserve the illusion. But Hollywood is built on close-ups. Once the face fails, the career follows. As her appearance deteriorated, roles disappeared. Grahame was pushed from leading parts into minor roles and low-budget productions. By the 1960s, the actress who had once been Oscar-nominated and critically praised was increasingly sidelined. Critics were cruel, focusing on her altered appearance rather than the forces that drove her there. Few acknowledged the deeper truth. This was not vanity alone, but insecurity cultivated by an industry that punished perceived flaws. In her final years, Grahame became acutely aware of the contrast between her screen image and her reality. She avoided bright lights, refused photographs, and preferred dark rooms where her face could remain partially hidden. Friends recalled that she rarely smiled, not out of bitterness, but because smiling itself had become difficult. When she died in 1981, at just 57, many obituaries fixated on her appearance, missing the real tragedy. Gloria Grahame did not lose her beauty by trying to be beautiful. She lost it by trying to correct what never needed fixing. Few actresses in Hollywood history were defined so completely by a single physical feature as Veronica Lake. Her famous peekaboo hairstyle, a cascade of blonde hair falling over one eye, was not just a look but a cultural phenomenon. Women across America copied it, magazines celebrated it, and studios marketed it as her signature. Combined with her petite frame, cool screen presence, and mysterious detachment, Lake became the perfect embodiment of film noir elegance. But what happens when the one feature that defines a career begins to disappear? At the height of her fame in the early 1940s, Lake seemed untouchable. Films like This Gun for Hire and The Blue Dahlia presented a woman of effortless allure, her beauty sharpened by restraint rather than excess. Yet behind the scenes, pressure was building. Difficult marriages, professional conflicts, and the relentless pace of wartime Hollywood began to take a toll. Lake increasingly turned to alcohol, first as relief, then as dependency. The earliest signs of decline were easy to miss. Subtle shadows under the eyes, a tightening of expression, moments of volatility that studios quietly worked around. During World War II, Lake made a highly publicized patriotic gesture by cutting her hair. Factory workers copying her peekaboo style were experiencing dangerous accidents around machinery, and she agreed to abandon the look to promote safety. To the public, it seemed noble. Behind the scenes, it concealed a harsher truth. Lake was already suffering from severe hair loss caused by stress, poor nutrition, and years of harsh styling. When the hair that had defined her vanished, so did her protective armor. How does an actress survive when her defining image collapses overnight? By the late 1940s, Lake's appearance had changed noticeably. Her hair grew thin and brittle. Alcohol and insomnia left her face puffy and prematurely lined. Her once delicate figure fluctuated, and the cool mystery that had captivated audiences gave way to a harder, more defensive presence. Studios reacted swiftly. Paramount dropped her contract, and major roles evaporated. Without steady work or support, her decline accelerated. The 1,950 seconds were devastating. Financial instability, failed marriages, and deepening alcoholism stripped away any remaining structure in her life. Photographs from this period show a woman scarcely recognizable from the noir icon of a decade earlier. Her skin appeared bloated, her hair poorly maintained, and her eyes reflected exhaustion rather than allure. By the early 1960 seconds, Lake had reached bottom. Broke and struggling with addiction and mental health issues, she was discovered working as a barmaid in a New York hotel, unrecognized by most patrons. A brief attempt at a comeback in 1970 only underscored the transformation. In Flesh Feast, audiences saw a woman marked by years of damage, her former elegance replaced by visible strain. When Lake died in 1973 at just 50, the contrast between her final images and her screen legacy was shocking. The cruel irony of her story is unmistakable. The hair that made her famous was the first thing to go, leaving her exposed in an industry that offered no mercy once the illusion was gone. Some Hollywood declines unfold slowly, marked by small changes over decades. Barbara Payton's collapse was different. It was violent, rapid, and so extreme that it became a cautionary legend within the industry. In less than 10 years, she transformed from a breathtaking young starlet into a woman almost unrecognizable even to those who had known her. Few stories better illustrate how quickly beauty, status, and protection could vanish in Hollywood's golden age. When Payton arrived in Hollywood in the late 1940s, her beauty was impossible to ignore. With platinum blonde hair, a voluptuous figure, and a face that blended innocence with sensuality, she seemed destined for stardom. Studios saw in her the potential of the next great blonde icon. By 1950, she had secured a contract with Warner Brothers and appeared alongside major stars. Photographs from this period show a woman glowing with confidence, her features soft, symmetrical, and effortlessly camera-ready. At that moment, nothing suggested how fast everything would unravel. The collapse began not with aging, but with scandal. Payton's personal life became increasingly chaotic, marked by public drunkenness, volatile relationships, and a notorious love triangle involving actors Franchot Tone and Tom Neal. When Neal brutally assaulted Tone, leaving him hospitalized, the scandal exploded across Hollywood. Studios that once celebrated Payton's beauty now saw her as a liability. In an era obsessed with image control, public disgrace was unforgivable. Warner Bros. Dropped her contract, and the safety net disappeared almost overnight. What happens when the industry that built you decides you are no longer worth protecting? Without steady work, Payton's life spiraled. Alcohol and drug use intensified, and the physical changes followed quickly. At first, the transformation was subtle. Puffiness around the eyes, a hardness in her expression, fluctuations in weight, but within a few years, the deterioration became shocking. Her skin lost its clarity, her features coarsened, and the softness that once defined her face vanished. By the mid-1950s, photographs already showed a woman who looked far older than her age. By 1960, the fall was complete. Unable to secure acting work and struggling with severe addiction, Payton turned to prostitution, first in relatively controlled environments, then on the streets of Hollywood Boulevard. A series of arrests produced mugshots that documented her physical decline with brutal honesty. These images show a transformation that feels almost unreal. Bloated features, damaged skin, broken teeth, and eyes emptied of hope. In barely a decade, she appeared to have aged 30 years. In 1967, Payton returned to her parents' home, gravely ill and exhausted. Neighbors reportedly failed to recognize the woman she had become. She died later that year at just 39. What makes Barbara Payton's story so devastating is not only the loss of extraordinary beauty, but the speed of its destruction. She did not fade. She crashed, a reminder of how brutally Hollywood discards those it no longer finds useful. If any actress truly understood the power of image, it was Marlene Dietrich. From the moment she emerged as an international sensation, she treated beauty not as something natural, but as something engineered. With sculpted cheekbones, carefully arched brows, and a gaze sharpened by perfect lighting, Dietrich built one of the most controlled and enduring images in cinema history. She did not simply appear glamorous, she designed glamour itself. But what happens when a woman who has mastered illusion can no longer accept reality? Unlike many stars shaped entirely by studios, Dietrich actively controlled how she was seen. She worked obsessively with cinematographers, demanded precise lighting, and knew exactly which angles preserved her perfection. This control allowed her beauty to endure longer than most. Even as she entered middle age, she appeared timeless, her image seemingly immune to decay. Yet that same mastery became a trap. Having built her identity around an unchanging ideal, Dietrich found herself unable to adapt when age inevitably altered her face. As the years passed, she refused to develop a new image of mature beauty. Instead, she attempted to preserve her youth through increasingly extreme measures. According to those closest to her, Dietrich relied on surgical tape hidden beneath her hairline to pull her skin tight, creating a temporary facelift effect so severe it sometimes prevented her from fully closing her eyes or mouth. She wore elaborate wigs to maintain the illusion of her signature blonde hair and bound herself into restrictive corsets to preserve a youthful silhouette. How much pain is someone willing to endure to protect an image the world refuses to let go? Her relationship with photography grew increasingly tense. Once the woman who commanded the camera better than anyone, Dietrich became terrified of uncontrolled images. She allowed herself to be photographed only under carefully arranged conditions. As paparazzi culture expanded, that control slipped away. The illusion began to crack. The breaking point came in 1975, when Dietrich fell during a performance in Australia and broke her leg at the age of 73. Photographs captured her being carried to an ambulance not as a goddess of glamour, but as a frail, elderly woman. The publication of those images devastated her. Shortly afterward, she withdrew completely from public life. Was this retreat an act of dignity or surrender? For the final 12 years of her life, Dietrich lived as a recluse in her Paris apartment. She refused visitors, disconnected her phone, and communicated with the outside world only through letters. She allowed no photographs. Mirrors were reportedly removed from her home. Those who did see her described a woman whose legendary features had softened and sagged, her posture bent, her eyes clouded with age. Without the tools that once maintained her illusion, she looked like what she was, an old woman. Yet, in the public imagination, Dietrich remains eternally young, preserved in black and white perfection. Her disappearance protected that image, but at a profound personal cost. She chose invisibility over imperfection. isolation over adaptation. In doing so, she controlled the final frame of her life. Marlene Dietrich did not lose her beauty to time. She locked it away and locked herself away with it. If Hollywood ever produced a beauty that felt almost unreal, it was Elizabeth Taylor in her prime. Her violet eyes, a genetic rarity, seemed to glow from within, framed by perfect features and a voluptuous figure that defined classic screen glamour. Unlike many actresses whose appeal depended heavily on lighting or illusion, Taylor's beauty translated effortlessly from film to real life. Whether in epic productions or candid photographs, she appeared impossibly flawless. But what happens when a face built on perfection is slowly reshaped by pain rather than age? Taylor's transformation did not begin with vanity or desperation. It began with illness. Even in her youth, her body carried hidden damage. A serious back injury suffered during childhood would follow her for decades, leading to chronic pain and repeated medical interventions. By her 30s, surgeries and long periods of immobility began to affect her physical condition. Weight gain followed, not from excess, but from limitations imposed by pain and recovery. The first visible changes unsettled audiences accustomed to her perfection. The 1,970 seconds brought a series of health crises that permanently altered her appearance. A near-fatal case of pneumonia required an emergency tracheotomy, leaving a visible scar on her throat. For a woman whose image had once been immaculate, this mark symbolized a shift she could no longer hide. Respiratory illnesses continued, weakening her body and reducing her physical resilience. As medical challenges accumulated, so did reliance on prescription medications, further affecting her weight and facial structure. How does a woman whose beauty once seemed indestructible reconcile with a body that keeps betraying her? By the 1,980 seconds, the transformation was undeniable. Taylor's face, once defined by sharp bone structure, softened noticeably. Her weight fluctuated dramatically, sometimes adding dozens of pounds. Yet, unlike many actresses who withdrew from public view, Taylor remained visible. She continued attending events, granting interviews, and accepting awards, fully aware that each appearance invited comparison to her younger self. Was this defiance, acceptance, or something more complicated? The most significant change came in the late 1,990 seconds, when Taylor underwent surgery to remove a benign brain tumor. Though successful, the procedure and recovery further limited her mobility and accelerated physical decline. Photographs from her later years show a woman still unmistakably Elizabeth Taylor, yet transformed by years of illness. The famous violet eyes remained, but the face surrounding them bore the unmistakable marks of endurance rather than glamour. What distinguishes Taylor's story from others is her refusal to apologize for aging. She did not attempt to disappear or maintain an impossible illusion. Instead, she allowed herself to be seen as she was, scars, weight, and all. Her beauty did not vanish. It evolved into something heavier, marked by survival rather than fantasy. In an industry that punished women for visible change, this visibility was its own form of rebellion. When Elizabeth Taylor died in 2011, the world remembered her for her beauty. But her later years revealed something rarer: the courage to remain present when perfection was no longer possible. Her eyes may have dimmed, but they never looked away. Judy Garland's transformation remains one of Hollywood's most painful because it unfolded in full view and began far too early. When she appeared in The Wizard of Oz at just 16, she embodied a fresh, wholesome beauty that felt honest and approachable. With expressive eyes and a natural warmth, Garland did not look like an untouchable goddess. She looked human. That quality made audiences love her and made the industry feel entitled to control her. From the moment she signed with MGM, Garland's body became studio property. Executives criticized her weight relentlessly, mocking her appearance and demanding constant adjustment. To keep her thin and productive, studio doctors prescribed amphetamines to suppress her appetite and barbiturates to force sleep. This chemically enforced routine began while she was still a teenager. What happens to a body when it is trained to perform on drugs before it even finishes growing? And what happens to a sense of self when rest, hunger, and emotion are no longer natural experiences? By her early 20s, the damage was visible. Dark circles settled beneath her eyes. Her weight fluctuated wildly as drug cycles intensified. Though she could still appear luminous under studio lighting, off-camera Garland looked exhausted, anxious, and prematurely aged. The strain deepened as MGM continued to exploit her talent while offering no protection. When she was fired from the studio in 1950 at just 28, she had already endured years of chemical dependency, emotional abuse, and physical collapse. The 1,950 seconds brought moments of triumph and devastation in rapid succession. Her comeback performances showcased flashes of her former beauty and immense talent, but each recovery was followed by breakdowns, hospitalizations, and suicide attempts. With every cycle, her appearance deteriorated further. Her skin lost its youthful clarity. Her expressions hardened with fatigue. Makeup artists worked desperately to preserve the illusion that her body could no longer sustain. How long can someone borrow beauty from lighting and cosmetics before reality breaks through? By the 1,960 seconds, Garland's transformation was undeniable. Still in her early 40s, she appeared decades older. Her face carried the tightness and fragility common to long-term stimulant use. Her body swung between extreme thinness and bloating. Most haunting were her eyes. Once playful and open, they now reflected pain, determination, and a constant struggle to remain upright. Critics noted that even when her voice soared, her body seemed to be failing beneath it. Garland died in 1969 at just 47. The coroner reportedly remarked that her body showed the wear of someone far older. Her beauty was not lost to vanity, illness, or age. It was consumed by an industry that demanded perfection while systematically dismantling her health. The tragedy of Judy Garland is not that she aged badly, it is that she was never allowed to age at all. Hollywood took her youth, borrowed her beauty, and left her with nothing to grow old with. Jean Seberg represented a new kind of beauty. With her short pixie haircut, delicate features, and effortless style, she embodied a modern, intellectual elegance that felt radically different from traditional Hollywood glamour. In films like Breathless, she appeared natural, unforced, and emotionally transparent. Her beauty seemed to come from clarity rather than polish. Audiences saw intelligence in her eyes and independence in her posture. She was not styled into perfection, she looked real. But what happens when that fragile authenticity collides with forces determined to destroy it? Unlike many actresses whose decline stemmed from excess or self-destruction, Seberg's transformation began with external persecution. Her political activism, particularly her support for civil rights causes, attracted the attention of the FBI. Under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover, she became the target of a sustained harassment campaign that included surveillance, intimidation, and deliberate attempts to ruin her public image. This pressure did not remain abstract. It entered her private life with devastating consequences. The most traumatic blow came in 1970 while Seberg was pregnant. False information was leaked to the press, suggesting that the father of her child was not her husband, but a Black Panther member. The scandal spread rapidly. The stress reportedly triggered premature labor, and her baby died shortly after birth. In an act of grief and defiance, Seberg held an open casket funeral to disprove the lie. Can beauty survive when grief is forced into public spectacle? Can a person remain whole after such a violation? After this trauma, visible changes began to appear. Still young, Seberg's face retained its structure, but the light behind it dimmed. Her expressions grew guarded. The confidence that once defined her screen presence was replaced by tension and sadness. As the years passed, psychological strain deepened. She experienced paranoia, depression, and repeated suicide attempts. Friends later recalled her constant fear of being watched, a fear that, tragically, was not imagined. These struggles inevitably affected her appearance. Alcohol and medication caused bloating and redness in her skin. Her once slender figure became uneven. Movements that had been natural and relaxed grew hesitant. Her eyes, once bright with curiosity, now reflected exhaustion and distrust. By the late 1,970 seconds, though not yet 40, she appeared far older than her years. directors became hesitant to cast her, fearing instability. With fewer roles came financial stress, accelerating the downward spiral. In August 1979, Seberg disappeared from her Paris apartment. Days later, she was found dead in her car, the result of an apparent suicide involving alcohol and barbiturates. She was 40 years old. The contrast between the vibrant young woman preserved on film and the haunted figure of her final years is brutal. Her beauty was not undone by age, vanity, or addiction alone. It was systematically dismantled by pressure, persecution, and grief. John Seberg's tragedy lies in this cruel division. Cinema preserved her as a symbol of youthful modernity, while real life stripped her piece by piece. The beauty remained on screen. The woman did not. Clara Bow did not simply have it. She defined it. As the original It Girl of the 1920 seconds, Bow represented a revolutionary new kind of beauty, vibrant, sexual, spontaneous, and unmistakably American. With her heart-shaped face, expressive eyes, and famously animated lips, she brought a raw energy to the silent screen that made other actresses seem distant and artificial. Her beauty was not about perfection, it was about vitality. But what happens when the spark that defines a generation burns too fast to survive? At her peak, Bow was the most famous woman in America. Films like It and Wings turned her into a cultural phenomenon. She received tens of thousands of fan letters each month. Young women copied her hair, her clothes, her attitude. Coming from poverty, she embodied a working-class sensuality that felt authentic and intoxicating. Yet behind that explosive charm lay deep psychological wounds. Bow's childhood had been marked by trauma, instability, and fear experiences that fame could mask but never heal. The transition from silent films to sound marked the beginning of her unraveling. Though her voice was not the obstacle Hollywood mythology later claimed, the pressure of sound production intensified her anxiety. Microphones, rigid dialogue, and technical constraints stripped away the spontaneity that had defined her screen presence. As expectations mounted, Bow's mental health deteriorated. Insomnia left her exhausted. Anxiety etched itself into her expression. Her weight fluctuated as stress disrupted her eating patterns. The sparkle audiences adored began to dim. How long can someone perform joy when they are barely holding themselves together? By 1931, at just 26, Bow suffered a highly publicized nervous breakdown. Photographs from this period reveal a startling transformation. Her face, once alive with playful energy, appeared drawn and haunted. The wide-eyed, open expression that had defined her beauty was replaced by guarded tension. Still young, she already looked prematurely aged by fear and exhaustion. Rather than allowing recovery within the industry, Hollywood quickly moved on. Bow retired from films in 1933 at only 28, retreating to a ranch far from the spotlight. While the escape offered temporary relief, it also removed the structure that had held her together. Without studio discipline and constant camera scrutiny, her appearance changed rapidly. She gained weight, her hair lost its iconic styling. Most devastatingly, her mental health did not recover. Throughout the following decades, Bow endured repeated episodes of severe psychological illness, requiring hospitalization and long periods of isolation. By the 1950 seconds, when many actresses were enjoying mature careers, Bow was nearly unrecognizable. Rare photographs show a heavyset, withdrawn woman bearing only faint traces of the radiant star she once was. Fans who encountered her sometimes refused to believe she was Clara Bow at all. The transformation was not simply physical. The energy, the it, was gone. When Clara Bow died in 1965 at 60, she had been invisible to the public for over 30 years. Her tragedy lies not just in the loss of beauty, but in the extinguishing of the very force that once made her irresistible. She gave Hollywood its most vibrant symbol of youth and was left with nothing to grow old with. Hollywood promised immortality, but only on screen. For the women in this series, beauty was never just an advantage, it was a contract. As long as their faces remained young, luminous, and controllable, the industry rewarded them with love, money, and worship. But when time, illness, trauma, or circumstance began to alter that image, the protection vanished. What remained was silence, rejection, and a mirror that no longer reflected the woman the world had once adored. These stories are often misunderstood. They are not warnings against vanity, nor moral lessons about excess. They are human tragedies shaped by an industry that tied a woman's worth to how well she could remain frozen in time. Some fought aging with illusion. Some retreated from view. Others were overtaken by forces no one understood when it mattered most. But every transformation shared the same cruel foundation. Once beauty faded, so did compassion. What makes these stories especially painful is how familiar they still feel. Hollywood may look different today, but the pressure remains. Youth is still currency. Aging is still treated as failure. And women are still expected to disappear quietly when their faces change. Have we truly learned anything, or have we simply become better at disguising the same cruelty? The silver screen preserved these women forever young, but it did not preserve their safety, their health, or their dignity. Their films allow us to admire their beauty, but their lives force us to confront the cost of it. Behind every flawless close-up was a person struggling to survive in a system that offered admiration without mercy. Perhaps the real tragedy is not that these women lost their beauty. It is that beauty was never allowed to evolve. It was trapped, measured, compared, and weaponized against them. And when it could no longer be controlled, it was discarded. So the next time you watch one of these films, look beyond the glamour. Remember the woman behind the image. Ask yourself what it cost her to look that perfect and why the world so quickly turned away when she no longer could. Because Hollywood never forgets a beautiful face. It simply forgets the woman once that face begins to change.